Welcome to Session 2 of the Bible course, Genesis, A Story Begins. As we've seen from the daily Bible plan, the story of Genesis begins with an epic account of the creation of the universe, followed by stories of tragedy, betrayal, and hope.
It also touches on fundamental questions. Where has everything come from? Why are we here? And why is life both beautiful and painful?
The story of the Bible begins with humans enjoying a beautiful garden. But we'll see how that beauty is soon ruined by a talking snake and some forbidden fruit. Now I know that sounds crazy, but stick with me here because this session will help us make sense of the stories of Genesis. And we'll see how the stories of Genesis make sense of our stories too.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light." So God created mankind in his own image. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number." The Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you will certainly die." The snake said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat? You will not certainly die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God." Then the Lord God said, "What is this that you have done? I will put enmity between you and the woman. Her offspring will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." The word Genesis means beginning or origin. It takes us back to the dawn of time and raises some important questions. Where did our universe come from? And what does it mean to be human? But Genesis is also hotly debated. Should we take these stories literally? 6 days of creation, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden. Well, Christians over the centuries have reached different conclusions. So we won't necessarily agree on all the detail, but the important thing is to understand Genesis in its original context. As the first book in the Old Testament, Genesis was written to a culture that saw the world quite differently. For example, they assumed that the sky was a solid dome or firmament and that the sun orbited around the earth. Now, before astronauts and telescopes, it looked a lot like this to someone standing on planet Earth. Even now, my phone will tell me that sunrise is 5:35 a.m. Now, that's not wrong. It's describing reality from our perspective. So we need to remember the two questions we introduced last time: what and now what? What did Genesis mean back there and then? Now what does it mean for us today? Then we'll discover the enduring relevance of Genesis for our lives. So what are the big ideas in Genesis chapter 1? Well, firstly, God. No explanation is given for where God came from. It's just assumed he was there in the beginning. And logically, that actually makes sense. As a parent, if you hear a big bang in your kid's bedroom, you shout up, "What was that?" A little voice replies, "Nothing." But you don't believe them, right? Things don't just happen. Someone must have done something. Now apply the same logic to the universe. God must have been there to start the whole thing off in the first place, which means we're not accidents. We're here on purpose and for a purpose. Secondly, God is in control. In the ancient world, Other origin stories told by the Babylonians or the Egyptians, they imagined lots of gods competing for control. The world was chaotic, with no one ultimately in charge. Not the kind of story that helps you sleep at night. But Genesis says, no, there is one all-powerful God with no rivals, and he didn't make the world violently in a struggle, but lovingly. In verse 2, we're told the earth was formless, empty and dark. But then God simply speaks, "Let there be light," and there was light. It's just so calm and orderly. Our lives then, we're not hostage to fortune or evil powers. We can sleep at night knowing that there is a God who's ultimately in charge. Now, the third big idea is that God is the source of all goodness. We've captured this on our storyline through the symbol of the tree of life, a fruit tree that represents creation as a whole. Now, in a sequence of 6 days, God then creates this beautiful world that we call home. These days of creation have a poetic shape to them. Remember, the earth was initially formless and empty. So in days 1 to 3, God separated light and darkness, sea and sky, land and oceans. A formless world is given structure. Then in days 4 to 6, God fills the world that he's formed with fish and birds and stars and animals. Now, you can tell a lot about a person from the things they make. So based on the world around us, what is God like? Well, he didn't create a few species, but over 9 million plants and animals. He gave thousands of taste buds so we can enjoy food together. Instead of a grayscale world, we have eyes that detect 1 million shades of color. The God behind all of this, he must be so creative, joyful, and generous, don't you think? The universe is a beautiful piece of artwork, and Genesis introduces us to the artist. But you may be thinking, is this really how the earth was formed? Doesn't science give a very different explanation to how it all started? Is there a conflict between science and faith? Well, let's hear from someone who's given this a lot of thought.
There is a perception that there is a conflict between science and faith, but it really has no historical or philosophical basis. There is a strong emphasis in the scriptures on glorifying God, and natural philosophers 300 or 400 years ago recognized that one way of glorifying God was to understand God's creation. There's also a strong emphasis on the scriptures of creation being law-governed, and human beings who are made in the image of God have the ability to understand how those laws work. So there was a real impetus within Christian thought and within the church that led to what we now call science. There were loads and loads and loads of creation stories going around in the ancient world. And what the writer of Genesis does is pick up different elements of those stories and tell a story about the nature of God and the nature of creation. What, as it were, is the underlying logic, the why of creation. They're not so interested in the how, in the scientific processes as we would understand them, so much as understanding that God is a creator, he's a lawgiver, there's a rationality, a beauty and a goodness to creation, and that human beings are part of and have a particular role within creation. The simplest way of putting it is that science looks for the how and religion looks for the why. That is a bit simplistic, but the important point is that you can look at science and religion, or science and faith, as overlapping entities, as overlapping human activities. They're not completely distinct, but nor are they doing exactly the same thing. The best way of looking at them is they're complementary to one another. Nature of human relationship to the rest of the world has vexed and interested the most intelligent minds of the last 2,500 years or so. And you glimpse that in the early chapters of Genesis by understanding us as this strange creature that bridges the natural world, but also the divine world. So there's a popular impression that scientists aren't religious or scientists don't have faith. That really isn't true. For a start, in the Middle Ages, an age that was supposed to be completely devoid of science, there are early, what we would call proto-scientists, who are deeply faithful people. Modern science begins in the 16th century. There are figures like Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. What you do sometimes find is that these figures have a slightly eccentric or provocative belief. They're not always the most orthodox of believers, but to imagine that being a scientist necessitated them being unbelievers or outright atheists is simply historically untrue.
On day 6, God created humans as the crowning glory of creation. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." So God created mankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number." Over the centuries, these verses from Genesis have been theological dynamite. Most ancient cultures assumed there's a hierarchy within the human race. Men are superior to women. Kings are above slaves. The strong rule the weak or the disabled. But Genesis is different. It says all humans are equal, made in God's image and likeness. Skin color, muscle power, or pay grade, it doesn't matter. Every human is sacred and worthy of dignity and protection. That idea is central to the whole Bible. Genesis chapter 2 presents Adam and Eve as an original couple who show us God's pattern for human life. He placed them in a beautiful garden called Eden. Now, what can we learn from their experience of Eden? The world as it was supposed to be. Well, firstly, we humans were made for relationship. Did you notice something strange in Genesis 1? God has a conversation with himself. Let us make man in our image. It's an early hint that God himself is a relational being. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, but three persons who love each other perfectly. You may have heard of this referred to as the Trinity. It means God is relational to the core. Now, since we've been made in God's image, it's no surprise that we're such sociable creatures, working, eating, playing together. The only thing not good in the original creation was for Adam to be alone. Now, despite being better connected than ever, our digital world is plagued by loneliness. We desperately need to recover the value Genesis places on family, friendship, and community. Now, we're also hardwired for a relationship with God. The name Adam means ground or dirt, so materially humans are just dust and DNA. But in Genesis, God breathed his spirit into Adam. This is what sets us apart. We have the unique capacity to host God's presence. And that means outward success will just never be enough, even if you get a top job and earn a fortune. We're made for something money can't buy, to know God personally. So the image of God is about relationships, but it's also about representation. Humans were created in God's likeness so we could resemble him. As the old saying goes, like father, like son. Now, of course, this isn't about physical properties. It's about our character becoming like God, so we can represent him to the rest of creation. Genesis doesn't depict a world where everything's sorted and humans just lie around on sun lounges. We are God's co-workers. He's commissioned us as humans to fill the earth and rule over it on his behalf. I visited a cathedral recently, which had some beautiful artwork on the ceiling. But to avoid getting a crooked neck, they gave me a trolley with a mirror on it. As I pushed my reflective trolley around the cathedral, all the beauty above was reflected below. That's our purpose. Made in the image of God, we are to reflect God's beauty into the whole world. However, by the time Adam and Eve emerged from the Garden of Eden, things had gone horribly wrong. In Genesis chapter 3, we encounter temptation in the form of a talking serpent. Now, whether this is to be taken literally or not is kind of beside the point. The serpent is an age-old symbol of evil. And I think it's clever typecasting. Our son has a pet snake, and even we don't trust it. There's just something about the way they move. Anyway, Adam and Eve had been given the entire garden to enjoy, including the tree of life. But there was also a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God told them not to eat from, or they would die. So here's a fork in the road. These two trees represent choice. Will humans trust God and enjoy abundant life, or turn their own way, which will ultimately lead to death? Now listen to the voice of temptation. "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God." The serpent whispers half-truths and sows seeds of doubt. God is controlling. He's restricting you. He's holding you back from realizing your potential. The fear of missing out was too much for Adam and Eve, and so they ate from the forbidden tree. This iconic story, I think it's still so relevant to our lives today. The voice of temptation, the suspicion that God is a risk and he's restricting us from our freedom, the forbidden choices and deep regret. After they ate, Adam and Eve felt shame. Now God felt like a threat to be avoided, the head teacher in the corridor, the hunter in the wild. So they hid. Theologians refer to this moment as the fall, because our human condition plummeted to an all-time low. When we think that we know better and we turn away from God, we experience guilt and shame, relationships are fractured, and the natural world is damaged. However, at the point of crisis, just as things are going wrong, God makes a new promise. To the evil serpent, he said, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Now, who is he, this mysterious serpent crusher who will destroy evil but be struck by the deadly poison in the process? Well, the rest of the Bible is pregnant with this promise. With these words of hope fresh in their ears, Adam and Eve then had to leave the Garden of Eden. Cut off from the tree of life, they now faced the harsh wilderness of pain and death. Life outside of Eden. And of course, this is the fallen world that we now inhabit. Perhaps you've experienced suffering or bereavement and felt like it's not supposed to be like this. Well, that's exactly what Genesis says. The world is no longer the way it was supposed to be. Now, these early chapters of Genesis, they may seem a bit strange to us modern readers, but let's not miss this big idea. God made the world good, very good. We humans rebelled and turned it bad. But God has a plan to restore everything. Spoiler alert, the tree of life that appears at the beginning, as we journey through this story, we'll see that it reappears at the other end. These are the hopeful bookends then that bracket the Bible story. However messy things get in the middle, Genesis says we've come from a good place, and Revelation promises one day we're going to get back there. Now, with this in mind, let's briefly consider one other major episode, the famous story of Noah and the ark and the flood. By Genesis 6, the spread of violence was so devastating that God was sorry that he had made humans. The world was heading in a bad direction and something had to be done. So God sent a great flood. Now, interestingly, several other ancient sources outside the Bible also record a massive deluge. But they said it was because the gods were angry with humans for being too noisy or too greedy. According to Genesis, that's not the case. God's not moody or unhinged. He's our loving creator who cares too much just to leave us to self-destruct. So if the flood reveals God's justice, Noah's Ark will reveal God's love. God told Noah to build a giant boat to rescue not only his family, but our human story, along with the animal kingdom. At the height of the flood, we're told that the waters covered the surface of the earth. Remember, that's how it was in the beginning, at the start of creation. The flood has washed the world clean and restored its original state. When the ark settled on dry land, Noah emerged like a new Adam into a new creation. As we read in Genesis, then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Can you see what's happening? We're back at the start. The pattern of Genesis is repeated. God made the world good, humans turned it bad, but God made it good again. After the flood, a colourful rainbow then symbolised God's promise never to destroy the world again. Peace was restored. Of course, the flood could not wash away the real problem of evil. Once off the ark, Noah got drunk and passed out naked in his tent. But in the rest of Genesis, God then set in motion a plan to cleanse the world from evil without destroying us in the process. Not through water this time, but by blood. Not a wooden ark, but a rugged cross. The stories of Genesis ultimately point us to Jesus.
Well, that was a lot. Creation, the garden, the fall, and the flood. Hopefully you were able to follow along in your course guidebook.
Yeah, and do you know what, guys? It's amazing to see God's plan to save his people right from the start. And actually, how these stories in Genesis point us to Jesus. You know, sometimes life's tough, right? And sometimes it feels like there's more valleys than mountaintops, but we can take heart because God's in control.
And it's so good to hear that science and faith aren't opposing each other, but that Genesis just doesn't necessarily answer questions in the same way that scientific methods would. And so I reckon we probably need both approaches to actually make sense of this world.
And you're so right, Sandeep. I found it so helpful to take a closer look at these stories. Stories that I first heard as a child and discovered that they're still relevant to my life today. With that being said, I'm sure you have a ton of questions. But remember, there's more about how science and faith go hand in hand on the Digital Hub. But for now, let's pause the video and discuss a small part of Genesis together.
So after that dramatic opening to Genesis, the story moves on to focus on a specific couple called Abraham and Sarah. Now this gear shift might feel a bit jarring, but as we'll see, their story is part of our story.
And like any family, it's full of surprises, joys, conflicts, and challenges. Yet throughout, God is faithful, and he makes some important promises that will echo through the rest of the Bible. And as we'll see, he uses ordinary people like you and me.
After the beautiful story of creation, things begin to unravel. Our fallen world is marred by violence, murder, and chaos. The flood provides a reset and the story starts again. But soon, the Tower of Babel is the latest attempt by people to take control and build their own self-importance. To save humanity from themselves, the Lord disperses them all over the world. They are now separate tribes with their own languages and cultures. In the midst of this broken world, God continues his rescue plan through an elderly couple who are unable to have children. This was God's instruction to Abraham and Sarah. Leave your country, your people and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Then God promised something that seemed impossible. Look up to the stars. One day, your descendants will outnumber them. This is what I intend to do through you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and all families on earth will be blessed through you. So, Abraham and Sarah traveled to a new land, which would later become known as the Promised Land.
The events of Genesis 1 to 11 are all big picture. Creation, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel. But by Genesis 12, we reach the Bronze Age, around 1800 BC. Now the story homes in on one Middle Eastern couple called Abraham and Sarah. But God still has the whole world in mind. God's plan to fix what's gone wrong will now involve a special relationship with Abraham's descendants. But it won't be until the other end of the story that we find out how this works in practice. So the second half of Genesis focuses on this chosen family, Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, who had his name changed to Israel. His 12 sons were then the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in Genesis 12, God made 3 great promises to Abraham. Firstly, I will make you into a great nation. This would have seemed impossible. Abraham and Sarah were already past retirement age and they had no children. God also promised a new land for their descendants to live in, Canaan, or the Promised Land. And finally, God promised that he would bless Abraham so that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Somehow, Abraham's descendants will bring hope to our fallen human race. The whole of the rest of the Bible story is an outworking of these great promises to Abraham in Genesis 12. Now, in response to God's promise, Abraham and Sarah relocated. In the ancient world, to cut ties and leave the soil of your ancestors, this was radical. But they trusted God and stepped out in faith, traveling hundreds of miles from what is now Iraq to the land of Canaan. I imagine they expected a miracle child would be born soon after they arrived. But for reasons we can't understand, God made them wait, and that can be hard. Eventually, Abraham and Sarah lost patience, took matters into their own hands. Abraham slept with Sarah's maid, Hagar. She gave birth to a son called Ishmael. But God never gave up on Abraham and Sarah. Isn't that encouraging? In Genesis 18, God restated the promise. Sarah herself will have a son. Abraham and Sarah just laughed out loud at this. But in the end, a miracle child was born. He was named Isaac, which means he laughs. You know, God always gets the last laugh. Read the story and it's clear. God didn't choose Abraham and Sarah or their descendants because they were just better than everyone else. God chose people who felt cursed and wondered if it was their fault. People who felt afraid and struggled with doubt. To be one of God's people is not to be better than. It's about being broken and yet blessed by God in ways we just don't deserve. God's love is greater than our failure. God's power works through our weakness. Now, what does this look like in practice? Well, the final chapters of Genesis tell the story of Joseph, who was Abraham's great-grandson. God gave Joseph incredible dreams, and his father, Jacob, gave him a technicolored coat. But this favoritism made Joseph's brothers jealous. They beat him up and sold him as a slave. Joseph then was trafficked down to Egypt, which is why our storyline goes south at this point, from Canaan down to Egypt. There he was falsely accused of attempted rape by his boss's wife and sent to prison. Now, how do you deal with that sort of stuff? You know, abused by your own family and then an outrageous injustice. But through it all, God was with Joseph. Suddenly, after years in prison, he gained favor with Pharaoh by interpreting dreams. He became prime minister over the whole of Egypt. and developed a scheme to provide food during a terrible famine. Now imagine that, one of Abraham's family blessing other families, just as God had promised. That's why Genesis concludes with this story. Joseph was broken and yet blessed by God so that he could be a blessing. Despite years of pain, abuse, and injustice, Joseph's life fulfilled a much greater purpose, saving many lives from starvation, including his own family. In a tear-jerking scene, Joseph forgave the brothers that betrayed him. Then Jacob moved his family down to Egypt, and they shared in Joseph's blessing. So the end of Genesis kind of begs a question. How will this chosen family return to the promised land that God promised to Abraham? We'll explore that in session 3. But for now, the story of Joseph sums up Genesis, which sets up the whole Bible story. God made the world good, very good. We humans turned it bad, but God will make it good again. And how will this happen? Well, God's great plan is to use multitudes of ordinary people. In fact, God promised Abraham that he would have more descendants than there are stars in the sky. And that plan is still unfolding today. Because of Jesus, our sin can be forgiven, our brokenness can be healed. As God's image bearers, we can be blessed to share God's blessing with others. We are invited to play our part in God's great rescue plan for planet Earth.
9 years ago, we had a problem with debt, and we had bailiffs knocking on the door. They were going to take everything, and it was just a feeling of hopelessness. So one Friday morning, we just looked at each other and we decided that was the day. We did a very silly thing of trying to commit suicide together. At that time, we didn't see a way out. So we took a lot of pills, and I woke up. Rod was still asleep, and I realised I wasn't dead. So I phoned for an ambulance. They took us in. They sectioned us, wouldn't let us see each other. And after we came out of hospital, these emergency psychiatric people came round. They gave us the name and telephone number of CAP, Christians Against Poverty. When they said, just phone CAP, and we phoned, and she said, can I pray with you? And she didn't judge us. It was amazing. CAP is brilliant. They are genuinely there just to help you. CAP saw us, picked us up, turned us around and put us on solid ground. They'd given us so much help, and our debts were paid off. CAP gradually got us towards Jesus and going to church. It filled a hole in our lives. Christianity for us has brought us more peace in our hearts than we ever had before. They say that once you found the Lord, things happen. We couldn't see any way out of our debt, but the Lord appeared with CAP. We've had such a good life since that, haven't we? He's just given us a new life, a new beginning. He's set us free from worrying all the time. Now we have the freedom to do what we want and be together and do it. I mean, in your 70s, you don't expect that. We cannot sometimes believe how blessed we've been becoming Christians. Since CAP, we thought they'd given us so much help and friendship and love that we decided that we would do something to help. We have tried to talk for CAP. With our CAP clients, sometimes they need just a bit of love, just knowing that the Lord is there for you. When we first started going to the CAP launch on a Thursday, at the time I was making cakes. So we took a cake. And it went down very well, didn't it? And then gradually, over the years, my hands have got worse. So Rod took on making cakes. He never made a cake before he became a Christian. But now he makes cakes. We make cakes for the students, we make cakes for church. And that is so important because we have been given the freedom to do what we want now, not what we have to. And that gives us the freedom and the love inside to be out and give it to other people. It's such a wonderful journey.
I found that so encouraging, guys. God still works through broken people. We don't have to be perfect to be part of his plan.
The headline sums it up nicely. God made this world good, and we humans made a mess of it. But God has a plan to make things right again. And even when our plan doesn't work out and we go through difficult times like Joseph, God still has a plan to work things for good.
That's a pretty good summary. And you know, Genesis reminds us where we've come from and why we're here. We're not accidents. God made us in his image, and God is at work in our lives today.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? I mean, God's got a purpose for us, no matter how broken or guilty we may feel. And you know, like Joseph and Abraham, we too can experience God's healing and forgiveness and more than enough blessing to share with others. So this week, let's begin each day with a simple prayer. Lord, show me how much you've blessed me and help me see who I can bless today. In Jesus' name, amen. Who knows what might happen?
So next time, we'll be finding out what happens to the people of God down in Egypt. So buckle up, because there's going to be some epic stories ahead. But don't forget, you can read your daily Bible plan to prepare for it. But for now, let's close this session with a closing reflection.